I think it will start to just become normal that these things are sustainable, and it will just get normalized as the years go by.
And I think people will require these things as well. The future generation, Gen Z, is already much more sustainable than any of us might be. So I think they'll demand it from developers to be more sustainable as well.
In the era of rapid urbanisation, the importance of integrating nature into our cities has never been more critical. As concrete jungles expand, the delicate balance between urban development and the natural environment faces unprecedented challenges. Biodiversity, the variety of life on Earth, is essential for maintaining the health of ecosystems and supporting human life. However, urban expansion often comes at the cost of habitat loss, fragmented ecosystems, and declining species diversity. Building biodiversity within urban landscapes is not only just about preserving green spaces, it's about creating a harmonious coexistence between human habitats and the natural world. This approach enhances the resilience of cities, improves the quality of life for residents, and ensures that urban areas contribute positively to the planet's ecological health. As cities continue to grow, the integration of biodiversity principles into urban planning and development becomes a cornerstone for sustainable and livable environments. The conversation around nurturing nature in our urban landscapes is vital for the future of the construction industry. To dig a little deeper into this, we need to chat to not one, but two experts in the biodiversity field, Lloyd Collins and Alexa Culver. Lloyd Collins works within Environment Bank's BNG Biodiversity Net Gain Advisory and Delivery team as an account director in planning and delivery, working closely with Environment Bank's developer clients to guide land and planning directors and their consultants through the often high-stakes BNG aspects of the planning process. Lloyd has many years of experience in the private sector and is a chartered member of the Royal Town Planning Institute and associate member of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. Lloyd, welcome to the podcast. And did I miss anything off that intro?
No, that was great. Probably made me sound a bit better than I am. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, let's see if I can do the same to Alexa, because it's quite unique, this episode. It's the first time on the podcast that we've had two guests in one, which is just amazing. So, Alexa Culver is the General Counsel at Environment Bank, a member of the College of Experts for the Office of Environmental Protection, and recognised in the ENDS report Power List as one of the most impactful environmental lawyers of 2023. As a lawyer with over 16 years' experience working on land planning, environmental and green financial projects, Alexa helps to inform policy developments in natural capital regulation and designs legal contracts, leases, and conservation covenants that maximizes natural capital value through novel and enduring financial and governance mechanisms. Right, Alexa, welcome to the podcast. Did I miss any? How did I? No, I'm not even going to say did I miss anything off. How did I do with that intro?
It was fabulous. It was brilliant.
Yeah.
Right, okay, I can relax a bit more. Both welcome. Delighted to have you both on the podcast. I'm going to dive straight into it because we've got a lot to cover. Two first, actually, before I do that, first in two guests and first lawyer as well on the podcast. So more than welcome.
I hope that's a good thing.
It is, of course, we welcome everybody, particularly within the construction industry, because we need experts. So BNG is a crucial framework that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than before. As urban areas expand, integrating BNG principles into planning and development becomes essential for sustainable growth, with the UK government making it mandatory for developers to deliver a BNG of at least 10%. So firstly, I'm going to come to Lloyd first. Can you explain what BNG is? And then secondly, why it's important in urban planning?
Yeah, so biodiversity net gain is a relatively new policy that came in on the 12th of February this year. So developers now have to consider biodiversity when they submit planning applications if they're not exempt, and they need to achieve a 10%. So they need to replace everything they've lost on site in terms of habitat, watercourses or hedgerows, and they replace that on site with a net gain of 10% on top of that. So it's been around in local planning policy and the national planning policy framework for many years. However, it's become mandatory for all of England. So it's not in Wales and Scotland, but all of England since the 12th of February. So we're now into the full swing of things.
Okay, fantastic. From an urban planning perspective then, why is that so important? Because, like, when I've seen developments going up prior to this, they do consider, or what I can see, consider green spaces, etc., etc. So why is this a government thing that they've brought in, and it's 10% at least being the key phrase there, I think?
Of course. So England is one of the most biodiversity depleted countries on the planet. I think we're in the top 10 by some metrics. Wow. So it's a way of development, thinking about nature a lot earlier in the development process and not just as an add-on, I guess, as it has been for a while. And it's making sure that there's a net gain, so a positive in habitat, not just replacing the habitat that's lost on site, but there's a net gain in habitats on site as well. And it just makes developers, planners, consultants think about biodiversity, even when they're starting to purchase sites. So it's become a very hot topic in the industry, and I think it's an important way, I guess, to replace biodiversity that's lost, but also for everyone to think about it, especially in terms of biodiversity loss worldwide, the sustainable development goals, and legislation that's coming forward.
Okay, cool. So Alexa, can you just expand on that a little bit when you're talking to clients and everything? This 10% comes into it. So where do you start to look at bringing that 10% into a development?
Well, I think, like Lloyd says, it's got to be thought about right at the beginning. The earliest stages, in fact, where you choose to develop, must be informed by what's already there. If there is already thriving, high distinctiveness habitats there, you've really got to think carefully about whether that site is appropriate to develop at all. And that's a sign of the policy really working, because avoiding losses to nature is the first stage in the process. Then it's only once you can't avoid losing those habitats that you then need to think through what is called the mitigation hierarchy. You've got to make sure that you do what you can to avoid the losses in the first place. When those losses can't be avoided, you've got to think about what you can deliver within the development itself, to deliver habitats for a minimum of 30 years in a way that they would thrive and flourish on the development site, which of course also has its knock-on benefits for the people that are intended to work or live there. And then where you can't safely deliver those habitats on site, where those habitat types aren't appropriate for being in that development, where they aren't really going to survive or thrive, that's where operators like us come in. You can buy biodiversity units from a habitat bank that is created somewhere nearby, where it's created at scale in an environment where the habitats really have the chance to survive and thrive, and where the habitats aren't under pressure from domestic use, domestic pets, too much human interference, really. And so the aim of biodiversity net gain as a policy is to make it really easy for developers in urban and rural environments to deliver the gains for nature that they actually often really do want to deliver, and in a way that doesn't need to interfere with the principles of what's being delivered on site, so that you can deliver it on site where it's possible, but where it isn't possible and those habitats wouldn't thrive, then you've got the opportunity to buy biodiversity units from elsewhere.
Okay, cool. That leads me really nice onto almost the role of a town planner, and that obviously pivotal in shaping sustainable and biodiverse urban environments. A study published in the journal Landscape and Urban Planning found that an increase in urban vegetation, just that cover alone, can lead to a temperature reduction of about 6 degrees C in cities during the day. And that's just one benefit for humans, let alone what we're actually talking about here, and that's nature and biodiversity. So, coming from a town planning perspective, then, what's the most effective strategies to employ or enhance biodiversity in towns and cities and developments then?
Yeah, I think for a while, development has come at a cost for nature, and this is one way of replacing it. So I think, we usually work with our developer clients at a very early stage, whether they're purchasing the land or doing strategic land, or, even they've submitted planning. And I guess B&G needs to be thought about at an early stage, as we said earlier, but it also needs to be integrated into decision making. It needs to be integrated into policy, and I think, it will change the way that cities are designed for many reasons. It'll change the way that developments look. It will change, numerous things. But in terms of town planning, I think, it's more about the design and making sure the nature is integrated well into developments, because for a long time it hasn't been.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting interplay as well with things like the urban greening factor, and where biodiversity net gain can sit with that. And from an ecological point of view, as you rightly say, Peter, there's questions about cooling inner city environments, but there's also about providing those all-important stepping stones for nature as it's going around, so to make sure that the birds have a place to rest, the bees have a place to feed. So those stepping stones, however minor some little patch of scrub might seem in an odd courtyard, these things actually play a crucial role in providing that infrastructure for nature. And it really can't be underestimated how important that is. And biodiversity net gain is now helping to bring a national framework that creates a level playing field so that all developers know where they stand when it comes to developing a site. And it's not totally left to the chances of what perhaps a certain local planning authority might want. Instead, we've got something here that's designed to try to bring uniformity, predictability, and crucially affordability for doing what's right for nature. And that's why we're real champions of this.
So on that, we mentioned at the very start, this is focused on a 30-year period. So when you start that conversation, what does that sound like, that conversation? Because obviously you're talking or predicting 30 years into the future. So where do you almost start? Do you start by, I mean, grass doesn't take that long to grow, but trees are going to take many years to grow. So what's that conversation and the start of it like?
So when we're speaking with landowners where we're creating habitat banks, 30 years is a long time. And those landowners need to be brought into that intergenerationally. You'll not only win over the landowners who currently farm the land, but also their grandparents, also their children. And that's a crucial thing for making sure that we really do deliver gains for nature that are necessary here if we're going to reverse the decline that we've seen for generations now. So with that in mind, you've also got to think from a developer's point of view, if they are going to be putting biodiversity net gain into their developments, they've got to be ready to make sure that that will be managed as it's legally required to be for 30 years. So again, it must be woven into the management structure, the management objectives, and the management budgets for that particular scheme as well. So the 30 years is a long time, and it needs to be thought about carefully whether you're delivering it on site or whether you're creating habitat banks off site.
Yeah, and I think the important element is if it was voluntary, I don't think there would be such an uptake as it is because it's mandatory. And I think the 30 years is important because you might have seen, some residential developments or town centres, because it's not looked after and maintained and monitored for 30 years or a minimum 30 years. Sometimes they're not they don't mature, those habitats. They don't, they fail, they don't look great. So I think the importance of the 30 years is to make sure that it's, done almost in perpetuity, and it's not left, you don't just plant and leave it. You're looking after, you're monitoring, and you're making sure that it does get to that target condition that you set out in your management plan. So I think, it is important that it's legislated.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're saying that you've got the infrastructure, you've got the buildings, and you've got the biodiversity, and each one of those needs monitoring, and it needs almost that golden thread throughout it. And I think that can be easily missed through biodiversity from the perspective of it's nature, it's going to deal with itself, it's going to handle itself, so just let it grow. But as you've probably seen countless times, and if you walk around the country, you'll probably see it. You can't just leave it to chance or just let it grow, because it needs a little helping hand, because we're the ones that are taking the initiative and changing that natural environment around it.
And it needs more than a helping hand, because, there's an actually, incredible art and science to delivering habitats. And it's a lot, it is a lot of work. And I've heard it said before in a sort of flippant way, oh, it's just free money. But no, I mean, to manage habitats involves really careful control of invasive species that can really take over any plot and destroy the diversity of what's there. You've got to have exactly the right soil conditions. You've got to make sure that things are planted in exactly the right time, not when a planning authority wants something to be planted before occupying a store or whatever it might be, but it's got to be planted when it's the right season for that particular species. It's about picking the right species. It's about picking local seeds for grassland and meadow. There's so much involved that is a really precious art. And it really isn't about setting aside land for nature. And while there is an important role for things like wilding, there is still a great deal of management, science, art, love, effort that goes into making this work.
Yeah, and I think the important thing about biodiversity, and again as a policy, is you have to replace what you've lost on site. So you can't lose a forest and replace it, with other low quality trees, or maybe not enough has been lost like they do in landscaping. So I think the importance is that you have to replace on a like for like basis what you've lost, which means that you're replacing exactly what's lost, which I think in if you're just doing landscaping in a town centre, or it's not legislated, then developers maybe would put back other species of tree or different types of habitat that's not suitable for that area. So I think that's important as well.
I think it makes for more interesting areas just from a visual perspective. You go back 10 years or so, and you go on to most developments, and you couldn't tell pretty much in the country where you were, because they all look pretty much the same, with the same things, and adding that level that you have to replace like for like, and adhere to that is, it's going to change the way developments look, which is cool.
And I think that's important as well. Back to why it's important for urban planning is to obviously the design of towns and developments. Access to nature is good for mental health. There's loads of things to think about. Clean air. So there are benefits not just from habitat, but from for humans, from other elements of it as well. Soil chemistry. Abundant pollinators for the food that we need to grow in order to eat. There's lots of different elements to habitats.
Cool. Okay, so I'm just going to move the conversation on slightly, and more broader look at leadership within construction. And as we've been focusing on net at the moment and talking on this episode, sustainability is a focal point for the entire construction sector. But change will only come about, obviously, through legalization and laws. But if the right people in the right positions and doing the right things, us as humans, we still need to do these things. According to a SAP Global survey into engineering and construction, 59% said a sustainable supply chain is a competitive differentiator. But nearly 50% said increased process complexity is an obstacle to meeting their sustainability goals. So I just want to start with Lloyd on this one. In a previous role, you led the B Corp certification process.
Yes.
Can you share some key lessons you learned from that? And just elaborate in terms of leadership from a sustainability perspective within construction.
Good question. Yes. So yeah, I'm also leading Environment Bank with help from colleagues to try and get certification with B Corp in Environment Bank as well, and that's a process that we're carrying out at the moment. I think some of the lessons I learned from previously doing it is that it just takes very small percentage changes in order to make the whole business sustainable and to think about things. I think a lot of companies don't sit down and think about how they can be sustainable or how they're having an impact without really going through all the questions within the B Corp certification in order for you to gain that certification. And I think it was interesting and good as well to know that the last company I worked for were doing a lot of things well, and it's just tiny tweaks to make things more sustainable, and it's not as complicated as I think it might seem from the outside. So I think being a leader in sustainability sort of trickles down. So if the company's sustainable, then it'll attract people who want to be sustainable. It'll attract businesses that want to be sustainable. So I think the trickle down effect it is good in sustainability as well.
To complement what you're saying, Lloyd, which I completely agree with, which is sometimes it's the cumulative impact of small things that make a huge difference. And then to take us to the opposite end of the spectrum, I really do love the big flagship projects where organizations go through the pain of a pilot project to really shine a beacon on what other corporates, other organizations could look to achieve. And one example I find really striking is the Eden office building in Manchester. So anyone listening or watching, look it up. And it's the biggest living wall in Europe. Now, living walls have certain benefits to biodiversity, but they're not huge in a strict BNG, biodiversity net gain context. But in terms of sustainability more generally, and in terms of making nature visible in this way, especially in urban landscapes, it's the most beautiful structure, and it was by Muse Developments. And the collaboration between the architects, the designers, and the way that they managed to pull that together, I just think is one example of big statement projects showing the world how you can be incorporating nature into what you do. So while it's not exactly a shining light on BNG specifically, it helps to move everybody's hearts and minds towards a nature positive future. And I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, and I think we've been working with a lot of the big house builders with BNG, and they've been implementing sustainability and biodiversity and other elements into their designs anyway without legislation. And I think some of the companies that maybe don't do that and integrated will get left behind because people won't want to live in houses that are not sustainable with access to nature, and employees won't want to work for companies that are not sustainable. So I think in the future, in order to have a legacy, in order to be considered, I guess, a good company, then they will have to think about sustainability in a lot more detail, I think.
Again, it's brilliant that how much the development sector has embraced biodiversity net gain, because you might think, to the untrained eye, oh dear, there's going to be resistance to this. But actually, what's been brilliant to watch unfold over these years, just like Lloyd said, is not only voluntarily doing these things before they even need to, but also being glad that as a sector, they're able to talk about being nature positive with a nice, neat regulatory framework around it that tells everybody what you've got to do and when you've got to do it by. So it's a great, it's actually been really wonderful to see how much a sector has embraced this, and we really support that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Lloyd, were you going to add something then?
I was just going to add, it was very similar to what Alexa said, but we work with the likes of National Grid and all the water companies, and they have internal policies on biodiversity net gain to reach 10%. Clarion Housing, affordable housing, they're doing 20% net gain. So it's nice to see that, they're embracing it, but sometimes going beyond that and doing biodiversity net gain where it isn't legislated. And I think that's what will push other companies and their suppliers and contractors to do it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because we spoke about 10% at the very start, and it's almost, you could focus too much on that 10% and try and reach that as that's the bar you're going for. But that's the minimum, and you don't really want to see the minimum. Why should you aim for 10%? That shouldn't be the thing that you're aiming for. That should be your base level, and then go up from there, basically.
Yeah.
Having said that, leads me nicely. Honestly, seamless. This podcast is utterly seamless. Rix has stated in the past that BNG could sustainably affect the financial value of land allocated for development. Okay, so this puts pressure on some developers in terms of project costs. Hoping you'll prove me otherwise. But what are some practical steps that developers can take to ensure that commercial and residential projects are both financially viable, but also contribute positively to local biodiversity?
Yeah, so I think there is a well-trodden argument path of the impact of nature on viability, and that is really the biggest point of potential tension. But in the end, what starts to become really unviable is flooding and global temperature rising and collapse of supply chains and all those things that impact, cost of insurance. So we view the cost of delivering biodiversity in a scheme must be and is actually affordable. It's just a question of making sure, as the policy has been designed, that there is a thriving, competitive, healthy supply of biodiversity units for developers to buy to support their developments. And crucially, it's that competition in the supply side and it's that demand on the demand side that together create a flourishing market that gets built into the real cost of development. Because what this policy does is it makes nature economically visible. Before, nature would be swept away without any recognition of that on any balance sheet or any profit and loss account. And really, if we're going to have any hope of addressing the biodiversity crisis, which is utterly linked to the climate crisis, because the two go hand in glove, they are linked together. By preserving biodiversity, by improving the way that water runs through the land, by improving with natural flood mitigation, with all the ecosystem benefits that come from improved pollinators and the better mental health and everything else, it is actually a very low cost for the rewards that are gained. And what we're seeing day in, day out is it is not pushing development out of viability. It is a cost to the development, but just like many other positive costs that are there to improve the development as a whole, they are being absorbed. And that's what we're seeing.
Okay. So Lloyd, when you're having conversations, either at the start or whenever it might be with developers, how are you stating these things, or what conversations are you having with, or are you having any that start with a bit of resistance and having to explain these things, or is everyone pretty much on board with what has to happen?
I think for the most part, people understand why it's necessary. I think most developers understand that, in order for them to have good developments, they need some sort of biodiversity. And I think, developers are used to other costs, and yes, it is an additional cost. But as Alexa said, developers are, coming to us. They are purchasing units, and sometimes, it does make their scheme better. It does make it more viable to go off-site with us. They can achieve more housing to solve the housing crisis by having biodiversity off-site in a land scale type recovery project like our habitat banks in the local area. So there are benefits to it. I think, yes, at the beginning that we have developers maybe not as keen to want to spend additional money, but I think for the most part, I would say that developers understand why it's necessary, and actually want to be involved in it and want to shout about it. And I think we'll start seeing more developers, shouting about how much they've spent and how much they've done for nature. And I think that's only a positive thing.
And I just add to that as well that one of the understandable challenges for developers is lack of predictability or reliability in their solutions. So what we're finding is there can be an understandable muscle memory, like, oh no, where are we going to put this mitigation land? What land are we going to use to do this? And how long is this going to take? And why is this holding up our planning? And all of that uncertainty is absolutely understandably not pleasant at all. So the good thing about what Biodiversity Net Gain does is it makes it a transactional. You can just buy the units you need off the shelf in an instant if you need them. And that's there to try to streamline the planning process, create that level playing field, and just take that uncertainty away. So yes, so I think as developers are going through the journey into the mandatory regime and watching the implementation period unfold of the new laws and watching the supply side really build up in this new market, it's bringing the confidence that they've needed, where of course in the early years there's definitely needing and willingness to learn, and we've been happily sharing our knowledge on that too.
Yeah, and you'll find that most large developers will have internal biodiversity net gain experts now as well, or they're starting to bring them in. So it's something that they're looking to do.
So what's the balance or ratio here in terms of buying these credits and doing things off-site, or actually integrating it into the development of a site? Is there a fine balance? Is it more one than the other?
Yeah, it's a very subtle and fine balance, actually. So it's all governed by what I mentioned very at the beginning here of the mitigation hierarchy. The most important thing is that the impacts to nature are avoided as much as they possibly can be first. Then the balance comes into what can you realistically fit on site in a way that would make the development still work and in a way that the nature would thrive. And there will be some schemes that are so huge, they literally have their own country park going through it. And it's like they've got their own habitat bank in the middle of it. And then there'll be others where it's absolutely not following the mitigation hierarchy possible to put any of these gains on site, and they would go off site. And they've got to, a developer just must show that they've done what they can, they've optioneered, they've worked out what could they put on site. But if that habitat type is not going to thrive on site, if it's the wrong types of habitat, if the site just cannot accommodate it in the way that it needs to be designed, then that's where they can go off-site. And watching how those decisions are made by planning authorities over these months will be a really important telling message on how that mitigation hierarchy is being applied.
Nice. Okay, so just final area that I want to cover is looking towards the future. And I think what we've discovered in our brief conversation today is that sustainable development is at the heart of creating resilient and livable urban spaces for the future. With most of the world's population living in urban areas, that figure's projected to rise over the coming decades. How do you envisage the future of sustainable development in these areas? Is it more of the same? Is it too early to tell? Or is there going to be a huge shift or something that we're not prepared for? What does the future look like?
I think as people move into cities, I think rural areas become a better option for some, so it might level out. But in terms of sustainable living, I think new technologies, integrating sustainable practices into buildings, biodiversity net gain, making urban and centres livable places that people want to live in. Build new technology, come up with new policy, push towards sustainable development, protect more of our nature, look after our water, our natural areas, and make make the world a nice place to live, as opposed to continue as we have been for the last 200 years.
I think the way I see it as well is I feel like the development sector plays such a huge role in how we live and work sustainably. In fact, such a crucial role. And some people even say developers are carrying too heavy a burden, in fact, of nature, responsibility for nature. You know, could there be more work going on more widely about improving nitrates and nutrient problems and the water issues, water pollution, flood alleviation? But really, the development sector and the construction sector is playing such a crucial role. And what I think we might see a lot more is an accelerated development programme under this new Labour government, where the idea, well, there may be more green or grey belt land released for development, connected through vital infrastructure like railways. We might start to see larger new towns coming into being, where the whole town is designed around sustainability and with biodiversity and nature protection at its core. So I think we've got an exciting time ahead, because we know so much now that we didn't know 30 years ago or longer ago when new towns were being developed then. And I think we've got an exciting time to really put nature at the centre of it. And it feels like there's a real willingness to accelerate development in a way that's truly nature positive, in a win-win for nature and for people, and for the development sector, and for economic thriving economies, for thriving economies. So I think it will start to just become normal that these things are sustainable, and it will just get normalized as the years go by.
And I think people will require these things as well. So, you know, the future generation, Gen Z, is already much more sustainable than any of us might be. So I think they'll demand it from developers to be more sustainable as well. And I think, yeah, just to add to the new towns, I think the difference between the new towns policy that's going to come into force very soon from this government and the last new towns, such as Milton Keynes, where they were post-war, so there was a requirement to build things very fast for housing for people after the houses have been destroyed. This time we are in a housing crisis, but I think we have time to plan them correctly, you know, to make sure that they are sustainable.
Yeah, I think planning correctly would be a wonderful thing to do, particularly for future generations and for the next 30, 40, 50 years and onwards. Alexa, Lloyd, thank you so much for joining me. I really do appreciate both of your time coordinating this, joining me and giving your input and expertise. It's a really interesting part of the built environment, if you like, or construction or development that is only going to grow and get more heightened, and more limelight is going to be, or more light is going to be shone on it. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No problem.
Thank you for having me.